So yeah, thank you very much. I was super jazzed to be asked to speak at this conference. A really neat set of speakers and topics. So thank you so much for including me. So, like Jay said, yes, this talk is about accessible UX. Um, I'm not a UX designer, so a lot of this is my opinion. A lot of this is also just things from my personal experience. Um, and we'll be talking about kind of some of the context for that as we go along. So, a little bit about me, if we haven't met before. Hi, I'm Devin. I use she, her pronouns. I've been doing digital accessibility work full time since about 2012. Before that, I had a brief library career, mostly in higher ed, but also in public libraries. So, listening to Corey's talk, I was like, yes, Blackboard. Blackboard's giving me flashbacks. Um, but yes, I come from an information science background, and I've been approaching my accessibility work with that. I'm currently an independent accessibility consultant. I'm based in Seattle, Washington, and I work primarily around education and accessibility operations. I'm also disabled, chronically ill, and neurodivergent, which is also going to come up today. Um, as we cover some of the topics that I want to chat about. So, my goal today is twofold. One thing is to kind of have more discussion around what cognitive disabilities can be or what cognitive issues might be. It's one of the big kind of gray areas for a lot of our work. And it's also really difficult to talk to people about often because it does seem like such a big problem and kind of very nebulous. So I want to be really concrete and talk about some definitions and some context for why those topics relate to each other. Then I want to go through some best practices and examples. Again, these are things that I've experienced in the wild or have been sent to me. And I'll talk through some possible solutions or some possible sort of good implementations. And then a brief section at the end, ideas for next steps. And then you at the end of the presentation will hopefully be cooler and more informed and a chiller person. So first, let's talk about background and definitions. So what are cognitive disorders? What is neurodiversity? What is a chronic illness? And how do those things impact us? And yeah, caveat, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a neurologist. Um, but I am an ex-librarian, so I've done a fair amount of research with this topic. And someone in the chat asked about slides. I'm going to post a link to the slides later, and there are a bunch of resources listed in the notes for the slides. So let's first start and just talk about like what does cognitive mean or what does cognition mean? And things that are cognitive are things that have to do with our brains. They're related to how we get or acquire information, how we understand it and process it, and how we then use our knowledge and experience. If you start researching this area, you very quickly get into kind of philosophy and psychology, which I'm not an expert on either of those things. But basically, anytime you hear the word cognitive, it has to do with our brains and how we use them. So, a few examples of cognitive function, so things that your brain does, are things like managing memory, learning, motor skills, attention, communication, understanding, information processing, sensory processing, and executive function. So, basically, like I said, everything having to do with taking information into your brain, how that works for you, and then what your brain does to process that information, and then also what you can do to make decisions with that information and act on those decisions. So that executive function piece is really a big one. Also, cognitive function is a little weird in that you might have issues with your cognitive function, but not realize it because of the way that cognitive function works. So it's one of those areas that it can be really difficult to know whether or not you have maybe a cognitive impairment, or it can be really difficult to kind of nail down what a specific issue might be. So that's the cognitive piece, and we're going to come back to that over and over again throughout the session, but that's kind of that first piece. Um, Next, let's talk about neurodiversity. So, neurodiversity is the theory that there's an actual variety of ways that our brains function, that people think, learn, behave, communicate, and develop differently. Trying to nail down kind of a number of people for this is really tricky because this again is one of those things where you might not know that you're neurodivergent, and also people that people disagree over what kind of fits into this bucket. But in general, about 15 to 20% of people are neurodivergent. That's an estimate. And then the other, um, oh, math, 80 to 85% of people are neurotypical is the other option. It's probably more like a bell curve than kind of like a very straight and narrow one bucket or the other. Um, Neurodiversity and neurodivergence is typically related to how our brains develop. So they're typically things that are with you from when you first are a person. They might also be caused by things like traumatic brain injuries, TBIs, but typically they're things that are with you from birth. So I mentioned that people don't always agree about what counts as neurodivergence. I think a lot of times when people talk about neurodivergence, they're really just talking about ADHD and autism, that those are kind of the two things that you can be if you're neurodivergent, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So other things that are considered types of neurodivergence are things like obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, Tourette syndrome, developmental disabilities like Down syndrome, learning disabilities like dyslexia. Those are generally agreed upon as things that are under that neurodivergence umbrella. Depending on who you ask, there are other things that are part of that umbrella as well. One is mood disorders like bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders like social anxiety, things like Alzheimer's disease, which is an organic process that happens that your brain is going to do or not. And then also cluster B and cluster C disorders like borderline personality disorder and schizophrenia. The logic is basically like, well, if things like ADHD and Tourette's and Down syndrome are because of how your brain develops, these things are also based on how your brain develops. And so those things might as well be under that umbrella as well. And this is where also that percentage gets hazy because, again, depending on who you ask, people put different things in this category. But just know that neurodiversity, depending on who you ask, can include a wide variety of different things, and some of which are things we consider disabilities, some of things which are things that people don't necessarily usually consider disabilities. So our last definition, and this one went down a rabbit hole I was not anticipating. I thought the neurodivergence part was going to be like the kind of wiggliest one, chronic illness. So chronic illness, and this depends on who you ask. This depends on the illness or the disease or disorder. But typically, it's an illness or disorder that lasts months or longer. Um, the big thing that distinguishes it from like an acute illness, which would be the opposite, something that's shorter, is that it requires ongoing and constant management. This might be medication, it might be avoiding certain foods, or certain environmental triggers, or doing certain behaviors or not doing certain behaviors. But you are typically having to actively do stuff all the time to try to maintain your health. It also impacts all facets of life. And I would also argue that the other two things we talked about do too, but we're just getting into the deep end here. Um, but specifically chronic illness, as a definition, says it has to be something that impacts all facets of your life. So that's going to include school, work, leisure activities. It's going to include like, can I go to this event? Do I have enough energy to go shopping today? It impacts relationships, pretty much every single part of your life. And chronic illnesses can also be dynamic. There's the concept of some disabilities or disorders tend to be more static, where you might have kind of the same experience or the same symptoms every day. Chronic illnesses are often dynamic. So, depending on the day, depending on your energy level, depending on how much sleep you got, depending on did you take your medication on time, depending on the weather, depending on how stressed you are, all of these different things can impact how you're feeling, and you might have a very different experience day to day as a result. So this is where things start to come together. So, common issues, regardless of what type of chronic illness you have, common things that people experience are pain, fatigue, sleep problems, emotional dysregulation, mood and anxiety disorders, and cognitive problems. Um, and these things might be the result of the actual symptoms of whatever your particular illness is. They're also often because of the stress and time and energy that we have to put into managing chronic illnesses. So even if everything's going great, you're doing all the things correctly, you might still experience these issues because there's only so much you can control. A lot of it is really out of your control, based on kind of what you're having to do day to day. And this is where things get weird. So I was on the CDC website, as you do, and I was looking for information about, like, well, how many people have a chronic illness? And I was able to find a number from 2018, which is feels like 8,000 years ago at this point. But in 2018, the statistic was that 51% of adults, or a little bit over 51% of adults in the US, had at least one chronic disorder, chronic illness, chronic disease. But then I looked more closely, and the things that they consider chronic disorders were from this very, very specific list. I've summarized it about a bit here because a lot of them were under the same topic, basically. But there was basically a list of 10 common chronic illnesses that were included when they were deciding what percentage of people have a chronic illness. There are things like arthritis, cancer, various types of different types of heart disease, asthma, diabetes, hepatitis, hypertension, stroke, and kidney diseases. And this all makes sense. These are all things that require ongoing maintenance, require ongoing care, can have huge impacts on your life, obviously. But they're not necessarily all the things I think of when I think of chronic illnesses. So, things that I think of, including chronic illnesses, things that maybe I have, or things that I have friends who have, things like long COVID, which obviously that 2018 number isn't going to include long COVID, but in 2022, 7.5% of people had long COVID that had gotten COVID. Um, it also doesn't include chronic pain disorders in general. It includes arthritis, but 21% of adults in the US have some sort of chronic pain from various different sources. It doesn't include things like epilepsy, which 3% of people have. It doesn't include other neurological disorders. It doesn't include autoimmune disorders. It doesn't include things like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder, which at least 1 in 2,500 people have. It doesn't include those chronic mental health conditions we talked about earlier, things like mood disorders, things like cluster B and C conditions, and so on. So this idea of kind of like how many people have a chronic illness just kept getting muddier and muddier the more I looked at this. And there was also I did start to see some numbers around like 2022 where about a little over 11% of people had at least three or more chronic conditions. But as soon as you say, like, well, what are you considering chronic conditions? It always goes back to those CDC numbers from 2018. And in fact, if you go to the CDC section of the website about chronic disease or chronic illness, they don't really have a lot of information about, like, there's not a lot of statistics. There's a lot of stuff about what individual people can do to prevent things, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. And they talk about kind of economic impacts, but they don't talk a lot about, hey, this many people have a chronic disorder. Uh, and that's because it doesn't look like they've done any studies since 2018. They've published more reports, and other people have published reports, but all of those studies go back to that 2018 data to actually produce that report information. So this was really frustrating, and this was kind of a rabbit hole I went down that I wanted to share with you. Because what this functionally means is that we don't know how many people have a chronic illness. Uh, what people consider chronic illness is going to vary for lots of different reasons, and whether or not someone considers themselves to be chronically ill is going to vary for lots of different reasons. And we really don't have a sense of how many people are living with some sort of chronic illness. And one of the things that makes this more complicated is that comorbidity, which is like the worst word, basically having multiple conditions at a time, is super, super common for both chronic illnesses and for neurodivergence. So, for example, using me as an example, I have fibromyalgia, which is a chronic pain disorder. I also have osteoarthritis, which is a chronic pain disorder. I also get migraines, which is, I think, technically a neurological disorder. I also have depression and I also have ADHD. Shout out everyone that got diagnosed with adult ADHD in the last couple of years. These things are super common to the point where there was a study I was reading about fibromyalgia where they were saying if you have a fibro diagnosis and you don't yet have an ADHD diagnosis, you should get tested for ADHD. Because of the way that the neural pathways work, it's extremely likely that you have both. And this is not abnormal. These things overlap very frequently. And so typically, if you have one thing that is, quote unquote, abnormal, you're going to have something else as well. And so this also brings us to the question, are all of these things I mentioned, cognitive issues, neurodivergence, chronic illnesses, disabilities? It depends. So some people consider what they have a disability. I do. Some people don't consider what they have a disability. It might depend on if you are applying for certain benefits or if you're trying to get accommodations at work or school, um, how you personally identify. Lots of people experience internalized ableism. That means that they just are not, that's not even on their radar. So there's lots of things that make it even more difficult to get a sense of how many people these types of issues affect. This also gets worse because there's a lot of research that shows that if you're in a marginalized community, because of race, sexuality, class, geography, education, things like that, you're going to be more impacted by inequities in healthcare, which is going to make it harder to get treated for or diagnosed with these types of issues. So whether or not you're actually going to know that you have an issue and get help for your issue, if you need help for it, is going to have a lot of variables, and odds are it's going to be much more difficult for some people than others. So all of this adds up to the fact that this is extremely stressful altogether for people that are dealing with these issues. And it's also really difficult for practitioners who work in accessibility to get a sense of like, well, who am I actually dealing with and what are our parameters here? So I'm going to come back to the stuff towards the end of the talk, but I wanted to um, just kind of set this up as the kind of the bigger picture of things I'm thinking about for this talk. So let's talk about something a little bit more concrete and something that maybe feels a little less big and scary and nebulous. Let's talk about some examples. So, like I mentioned, these are things that are primarily my opinions. A lot of these are going to reference WCAG, AAA, success criteria, or might just be best practices that combine various success criteria. And these are also all real world examples. So my intention is not to name and shame, but I want to show like actual things that I or others have encountered out on the internet. These are mostly from like commercial websites, but some of them are from like banks and things like that. So if you work for like a larger institution, hopefully you'll find some relevant pieces in here. If the rest of this talk slides off your brain completely, the things that I really want you to think about from a design perspective are giving context, being flexible in how you present information to users, reducing motion, make it make sense, whatever it is, and treat people like human beings. Um, there's a lot going on, and people don't have a lot of brain cells to spare. So let's make things as easy as we can. The examples I have fall into roughly 5 categories. The first one is going to be wayfinding. Then we're going to talk about links and controls, content and media, motion and animation, and then forms and workflows. So first, let's talk about wayfinding. So wayfinding is basically the idea of like, where am I? How can I get here? And where can I go next? If you are a person that likes outdoorsy things, for example, and you go on hikes, you're probably used to seeing signage in, say, a national park that kind of points you in the direction of different hiking trails. If you're in the grocery store, there's signage hanging that is telling you what's in the different aisles. All of that is wayfinding. It's the idea is that it tells you where you are, what you can expect to find there, and kind of like what can you do there. So the way that we figure that out typically on websites is the page or screen title. So a website or a mobile app, the whatever's in the navigation menu, and whatever the headings on that page are. Um, there's also other, success criteria around having multiple ways. So people might use search, they might use a sitemap, things like that. But for this example, I'm really just thinking you have landed in a place. What are the kind of the cues you have around you? Especially for people that aren't technical, what are they going to look to see where am I in the website? So I've got an example from the BECU Credit Union, don't dox me, um, where on their homepage and on all the pages, they have a little support link in the header, which especially if you're coming here for the first time, seems like a really good place to start. So if you activate the support link, it takes you to a page that doesn't have support as the title. It actually has common topics as the page heading. And the other thing I look to once I look at where I am in the navigation and what the page name is what is the page title up in the browser tab, which can get a little complicated if you have multiple pages for the same website open. Depending on how those page titles are written, they might all be the same. They might all just be like the website name first. In this case, this one says member services. It actually says common topics after member services, but since they've got multiple pages open and the tabs get shorter, that's kind of difficult to read. So um, basically, if I walked away from this page and I came back to it, I would probably not remember how I got here, to be perfectly honest. I probably wouldn't piece together that, oh, I clicked on support and I got here common topics about support, question mark. I might just be like, I don't know what page I'm on. I'm gonna go back to the home page and start again. One way to make something like this really, like really simple, well, I say this from a design perspective, it's simple. From an implementation perspective, it's going to depend, but just make them all the same is my recommendation. So I've got the support link, I've got support as the heading, I've got support as the first word in the page title. I also went ahead, one of the things that this page has is a bunch of sort of subtopics with tabs. And I moved the common support topics or whatever you want to call that first, because it seems like it's the first one you're going to go to, whereas it currently lives kind of in the middle of this list. So this is just a really quick example of things to think about as far as, what signposts have you put up to help people figure out where they are, where they've gotten, where they're going to. I do often see things like breadcrumbs, which can be helpful. I think, though, that if you're relying on breadcrumbs to do this heavy lifting for you and you're not doing it with these other pieces, that might be confusing as well. So let's talk about controls next. In general, make controls easy to see, easy to perceive. Make it easy to tell what's a control and what's static text. I don't want to have to guess if something is interactive. You also want to use active verbs for button text to describe what's going to happen if a user activates that button or that control. And it's totally fine to use icons, provided it's really clear what those icons mean. Sometimes it might make sense to provide an icon and text. Something I like that Gmail started doing, and I don't like a lot of things about Gmail, but one thing I like that they do is that you can either have you can set it to have icons or text or both for the controls at the top of the screen, which I think is handy. So this is going to vary based on what your interface is, but sometimes certain audiences really benefit from having both together, icons and text. You also want to help people differentiate without color. And this really comes down to color contrast. So I have a screenshot from Duolingo. And I don't know what the screen looks like now. I haven't used it for a while, but I personally, one of the things I do to try to reduce eye strain and reduce my chance of triggering a migraine is I use a red color filter on my phone and on my desktop. And this kind of shifts everything a little bit darker. And so things that are already have kind of low contrast, that low contrast kind of goes away. So one of the things that the Duolingo UI at the time at least had was sometimes there'd be a little character icon here, like B, kind of in your workflow in your lesson list. And there were three little stars underneath the character icon. And those were actually interactive. You could tap on those and get different little like kind of quiz interactions. Um, on the rig shifted version, you really can't see them at all. They're like a dark gray on the black background, and those go away pretty much entirely. And I would say that even the ones that are you can kind of see if you have good color vision, are they don't stand out necessarily to me as interactive. There's not a lot telling me that that looks like a button, especially compared to the very button-like buttons that are elsewhere on the screen. So differentiating without color, making it easy to discern like what is interactive and what is static, super important. Also related to that is control values and settings. And this depends a lot based on your operating system and based on your UI. But if you're doing anything that has any sort of switch type control, for example, I guess having a mock-up of an example of an autosave switch here. You want to use visible labels as much as you can. Uh, I was doing something on my TV the other day, and it's an Android TV, and I'm not normally an Android user, and I couldn't tell which switches were activated or not. So I had to kind of look at other settings to figure out which ones were on. Um, so it's perfectly fine to switch colors and update things like that in the UI when you are, changing a setting. But ideally, you want to also have a label. You want to have something visible that makes it very clear what are the two settings, what are the two options, which end of this little switch means what. And I understand that that's not always super easy to do depending on the UI you have. Um, Apple, if you're building a native Mac OS or iOS or Apple TV or any of those applications, they do have a differentiate without color option, which adds little tiny icons to the switches. So it has the color switch and the position switch as well as the icon. I don't know if those icons are clear. Like I've I have a master's degree in information science. I know what circuit diagrams look like. I don't know if people know what that little pipe means and what the little circle means, if those are clear that they mean on or off. Um, but it's something. But you want to make sure that people can distinguish what do these settings mean? Uh, am I turning it on? Am I turning it off? What's happening here? Another big thing, and something I've argued with so many people about, not accessibly people so much, but clients and just people in general, is underlining links, which just please underline your links, especially if they are, inside of a paragraph. Just underline them. It's so much easier to distinguish. Again, you don't want to use color alone to distinguish things. You also want to warn users before opening a new tab or window or causing any sort of change of context. So using like an icon or something of that nature. And if the link goes to something that's not a web page, warn people of that. An easy way to do that, if they're downloading a file, for example, is to just put the file type in parentheses at the end of the link. So I just have an example here that uses PDF as an example. Um, Here's my real world example for this issue. This was from a website about medical and social services that I was really stressed out looking at, trying to get some support for my elderly parents. And I was not expecting what happened when I clicked on these links. So they look like perfectly normal links. They're underlined. They're easy to distinguish from static stuff. I'm like, obviously these are links. Great. I go to click on one, and instead of taking me to a web page, they opened MP3 files, which autoplayed because it was just loading the MP3 file in the browser. And I'm like, okay, that's a choice. And maybe not the worst choice. Like it's probably good to have audio uh options. This is a website that's primarily targeted at elders. They maybe are assuming maybe people don't feel comfortable using the web. Um, but I then couldn't figure out if there was a text version of that content or if there was a transcript of that content. So guess what? I closed the website and did not return to it. Um, but again, there's some relatively easy ways to get around this. If you do want to have those different formats, great. Um, my little mock-up of this is just to say maybe there's a text version of the content. Maybe there's an audio version. You're warning people if you click on this, you will get an MP3. And maybe there's like a brochure version, like the glossy brochure version that's a PDF. You could do this with icons. You could do this with text, whatever it is you want to do, but just warning users as to what's going to happen before they actually activate these links. Because if I had known that those were going to open MP3s, I would not have clicked on them in the first place. So content and media, at a really high level, doing things like using plain language, or at least using language that's appropriate for your audience, is super important. I strongly encourage folks to treat captions and transcripts as standard. So if you're shipping video, if you're making a video for any reason, assume that you need to include a transcript, you need to include captions. Don't do those after the fact. If you're, creating a video and posting it on the internet, make sure that you're doing those things at the same time. Letting users determine caption settings for their own device and including a transcript that makes sense for the content. So a little bit more about that in a second. Just at a high level, plain language, if you're not familiar with plain language, it's kind of shorthand for typically an eighth to ninth grade reading level for general audiences. The idea is that this is going to support users that might have learning disabilities, developmental disabilities, as well as maybe people that didn't finish high school or don't have a lot of education. It's also going to be much easier to auto-translate if someone's using something like Google Translate to access your content. And the idea is just that it is easier and clearer for everyone to understand. A couple other things I would recommend that, and these do pull from some of the WCAG AAA guidelines, is defining unusual terms, jargon, or acronyms. Depending on your audience, some of the things that you have might not be unusual, but for example, if you have educational material and you're trying to teach people financial education information, if they're not already people that are familiar, you're probably going to want to define a lot of those terms up front. You don't want to assume that people are already going to know what those words mean or what those acronyms stand for. Another thing that plain language also includes is things like using active voice, shorter sentences, and simpler phrasing, basically breaking down your content into the smallest pieces so that it's really easy to follow and really easy for people to understand. What's the subject of this sentence? Where is this sentence going? Um, and this can be tricky if you're not used to doing it. It's something I struggle with all the time. And but it is a really good writing exercise to even do even if you're not writing directly for a more general audience because it makes you have to really think about what you're trying to say. Um, plainlanguage.gov is a great resource that has a lot of information about specifically it's a US government website that's so US government websites are supposed to use plain language. But there's a lot of really great resources about with examples and guidelines and best practices that you can hopefully use for your own writing. So one of the things I mentioned was allowing users to style their own captions. And this is built into most video platforms. Um, iOS and Android and Windows and pretty much everything else I can think of has kind of a default browser or a default OS level setting. You can change what captions look like. Things like YouTube, I have a screenshot of a YouTube video, also has options for styling captions. So the example I have on the screen is one where the people that made the video chose to do, and I always get these mixed up because it seems completely backwards, open captions instead of closed captions that are basically burned into the video. And it's a video about accessibility features. So I guess they thought that that was a good thing to do. And while it's not the worst idea, It is pretty small white text on a black background, which might not be easy for some people to read. The place where it lives is also at the very, very bottom of the screen. So it actually gets covered up by the progress bar. So depending on if you pause the video, how much of the video you've watched, it might be difficult to read. If you turn on your own captions because you need a different kind of font style, they cover up the other captions, which also makes it difficult to read. And they also have an ASL interpreter also like burned into the video, which again, not a bad idea. But that person is also kind of under that progress bar. So again, depending on where that progress bar is, or depending on what they're assigning at the time, it might be really difficult to understand. So these are good ideas, but the execution, I think, could be a little bit better. And um, I would be interested to know how many people that speak ASL that they actually consult to do this. It's a nice idea, but yeah, could be executed better. And an example for having a transcript in context. Um, The W3C just updated a whole bunch of neat little videos in the tools and techniques section of the Web Accessibility Initiative part of the website. Um, Really neat little videos, and they also have these transcripts that I think are really cool. Instead of just having a transcript, just text of just whatever the narrator is saying or whatever is being spoken. It's set up as a table so that you can tell what is being said and then also what the visual that's being presented is. Since the visuals are important in this video, showing people using different types of assistive technology, and I just really like the way that those things line up. So you're not guessing as to what's happening in the video when that text is being read, and you're able to really get the whole picture of what that video is trying to show people. There's so many different ways to do transcripts, but I want to encourage you if you are doing transcripts, they don't just have to be the text of what's being spoken straight out. You can present it in different ways that makes it um, easier to understand and tries to kind of get at the spirit of what you're trying to show in the video. So motion. This is a big one. Don't show flashing visuals. Just don't do it. There's a couple different success criteria around this. The goal is to prevent people from having seizures. Just don't make things flash. There are a bunch of neat tools that are built into some newer operating systems. Um, iOS, I don't know if Android has this, but iOS and macOS now has a dim flashing lights setting, which works across the whole operating system. And so even if you're watching a video that maybe has strobe effects, it will dim those. I had forgot I turned this setting on and I was watching a music video or something. And I was like, why is it so hard to see all of a sudden? So it actually works really well. So that's something I'd recommend turning on if you have issues, any sort of issues with flashing. But from a design perspective, you want to avoid that as much as possible, especially because a lot of people don't know that they have photosensitive epilepsy and things like that. So don't make them find out. Um, Similarly, you don't want to autoplay content whenever possible. You want to limit motion and animation in your designs as much as possible. And if people have like reduced motion turned on their device, you want to honor that in your styles, in your JavaScript, and in your mobile app code. And in CSS, for example, there is just a CSS property that says reduce motion, and it works like a oh, I'm totally blanking. Basically, you can say, hey, if someone has reduced motion turned on, show them this code versus if you don't have reduced motion turned on. So I have two examples next that are videos I captured. Both of them are pretty gnarly animations. So if you don't want to look at them, please look away. I will describe them. But I want to show some examples of like things that I have run into, even as a person that has reduced motion turned on, um, things I've run into in the wild. So this first one is a video capture from the Material Design website, where on the home page, in the kind of like upper right-hand corner of the landing page, there is a video that autoplays. And it shows a bunch of different art. that was created for, I guess, the current version of Material Design, which is cool. I get it. They put a lot of work into it and they want to show the art off, but it's also kind of gnarly. So I'm going to push play and it's going to autoplay that video. Um, and like I said, this is a screen capture. There is a button, which I'm now searching for in the video. There is a button that you can use to pause, but I have reduced motion turned on, so I wouldn't expect that to autoplay. There are also WCAG, like very specific guidelines around if something does animate automatically, what percentage of the screen it's okay for it to take up. But I think that that is a really slippery slope. You really don't and can't make assumptions about people's screen sizes, their zoom settings, their browser size. I think it's just safest just to not do that. Um, Again, it's totally fine to have videos and animations like that, but make them not autoplay, especially if someone has reduced motion turned on. This next example is a parallax scrolling one. So this is a website where well, I'll just show it to you. I'll describe it. I'm going to hit play. So there's an auto playing video in the header. And I kind of search around for what I think is going to be the pause button, but it actually opens a modal, which has another video in it, which I close. So to get away from the animation, I start scrolling. But because this is a parallax, everything on this website loads with parallax. As I'm scrolling, it keeps moving stuff. There's like a little bit of an oasis in the middle that where things don't move constantly, but for the rest of the page, as soon as I keep scrolling or move my mouse over something, it continues to load content. And it doesn't stop literally until the very, very bottom of the page. Um, and I'm sure someone was really excited about this. They were really excited to make the website really dynamic and really interactive. But it's also kind of nauseating. So don't do this. This is what I'm intriguing to you. Even if someone doesn't get motion sick or have some sort of photosensitivity issue, um, trying to take this in is exhausting. So don't do it. Just don't do it. And that is my last video of horrible moving. Oh no, don't do it again. Okay, now it's actually over. So you can look back at the screen if you were trying to avoid stuff. So my last few examples are about forms and workflows. I'm just going to check the time. Okay, I'm doing pretty good. So big things for forms and workflows, letting users offload information to tools like password managers, not using CAPTCHAs, and putting elements in a logical order for reading and interacting. I have a really brief video showing password managers, but I don't think I need to show it. Basically, don't prevent people from copying, pasting passwords into forms. Don't prevent them from using third-party things like password managers. It's a very important way for people to offload a lot of cognitive information, and don't do it. It's not really a security measure. It's not helping anything. It's not making it easier to use your website. So yeah, just don't do that. And the nice thing too about it is if you don't have to actively do anything to make them work correctly, you just don't do the extra stuff you don't need to do. Uh, I do want to show an example. This is a video capture example of using voice control on Mac OS. I'm not a native voice control user. I do use it occasionally, but I do like to use it for demos for things like this. So this was a website where I was just demonstrating using a form with voice control, and I got one of the Google "I'm not a robot" checkboxes. So I do want to play this to show you what happened. If it'll let me play it. Is it not going to let me play it? No. All right, I'll describe it to you. So, the short version is that CAPTCHAs are discriminatory. Even if they are technically accessible, they are not typically accessible to people with cognitive disorders, and they also don't really keep out robots the way people think that they're supposed to. So in the video, I have to use the grid function of voice control instead of just the voice function to check on the little checkbox to say I'm not a robot. And then because I did things that were robot-like, it then gives me the photo captcha that I would then have to go through manually as well. So again, avoid these if possible. They're not really keeping your website safer. And they might actually be making people spend a lot of energy and spoons on just trying to get through like sending a form to you. So my last example is a form example. So every month I have to pay my mortgage, and every month I log into a website to do this. And as soon as I log in, the next screen I see is this, and this is what my brain sees. The heading of the page is SMS authentication. So I'm thinking like, okay, they sent me a text, and I need to enter the information from the text into the form. Easy peasy, very normal. There's a bunch of instructions. There's like two paragraphs of instructions, which I immediately don't read. And then there's the form field that I presume I'm supposed to put the code in. A button that is probably the like, hey, I didn't get a code button. There's a checkbox for some reason that I also don't look at. And then there's like the big, like, oh, yes, I got the thing and here it is. Please send me on my merry way. But that's not what it actually looks like. So what it actually looks like is there's the SMS authentication heading. Then it says, please click on send code to receive a verification code sent via text to my phone number. If you don't receive a code, but try selecting resend code once it's enabled. So I read half of the text and I'm like, send code button. And I'm like, oh, they mean this send code button that's halfway down the page. Okay. And then, so then what's supposed to happen? I have to go up and read that part again. And this is a nightmare. I also am going to point out the checkbox says, do not challenge me on this device for the next 30 days, to presumably turn off this interaction. But that's how often I pay my mortgage. So I'm not like logging into this website for fun. So this is kind of a nightmare. What I would recommend instead, if they asked me, um, instead of forcing the person to push the button to send a text, just send a text. That's pretty standard at this point. What I would expect to see when I get to this page is that we're now at the SMS verification part. To complete your logging, we've texted a code to you. Great. The box I put the code in, the button I push to verify that I received the code, and then a couple of options. So a link that says I didn't get a code, and a link to say verify another way. There might be lots of reasons why a person might not want to use SMS verification. They might not have access to their phone. They might have lost their phone. It might be in a different room. It might maybe didn't work for some reason. You want people to have options for getting around these things. And obviously, this is more complicated than just designing this. There's a bunch of other moving parts behind it, but um, I would encourage you from a design perspective to be thinking about what is actually the best for your users and not just, oh, well, we have to use this technology. What's what's the least possible design we can do in this case. So to kind of tie the first part and this part together, um, thoughts for next steps. Typically, this is where I start talking about like your product development life cycle and all of these different things. But for this particular talk, I want to take a different tact. So, like I said, I mentioned that a lot of these build on the WCAG AAA success criteria, which you can't use all at once because some of them actually conflict with each other. So you can't just be like, we're going to be AAA compliant. That doesn't make sense. But what you can do is think about for your particular audience, for your particular, whatever your product is, don't just stop at WCAG 2.2 level AA. Think about what are AAA and also just what are usability best practices that would benefit our audience. And you can make those part of your own kind of internal guidelines. You don't have to use WCAG 2.2 level AA to the letter as your measuring post, as your measuring stick. Make it actually make how you measure it actually fit what you are making. Do research with users. I know this is much easier said than done. I know a lot of organizations don't do any usability testing, don't have any budget to do that, much less doing usability testing with users with disabilities or chronic illnesses. But this is so important, especially if you're making something from scratch. If you're making something pretty typical, great. Maybe you don't have to do this. But if it's a critical path like paying your mortgage, or something else like that, you want to make sure that you know that people are able to get through that process. Um, Michelle Williams is a star, and she has so many good resources. She's written so many articles, and she does consulting as well around user research. She has an article in Smashing Magazine called Conducting Accessibility Research in an Accessible Ecosystem, which I highly recommend. Another resource I highly recommend is MSC Siegel's Practical Guide to Inclusive Research, which I also have a link to in the slides. There's a whole bunch of articles. It's set up as a Medium publication, basically. And there's a whole bunch of different articles about considering accessibility and disability as part of your research. And I think something that I keep coming up against when I think about this topic and talk about this topic is, in a lot of organizations, accessibility is for everyone kind of becomes like the slogan, or becomes kind of like, well, we can get people behind this because it doesn't make them uncomfortable talk about disability or other, systemic issues. So I think sometimes it can kind of ring hollow. It's kind of the kind of the watered down version of what message we really want to convey. And so something I think is helpful, kind of at a more systemic level, is to think about it not from the like, we have to say it's for everyone because people get uncomfortable when we talk about who it's actually for, is to really put this into the bigger picture, which is a really big picture. So, um, I have a Venn diagram that is just the part in the middle is white supremacy culture. And around that are examples of things that are part of white supremacy culture, like ableism, classism, racism, fascism, queerphobia, transphobia, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I think at the end of the day, ultimately, what we're trying to do with accessibility is trying to counter ableism in digital spaces and physical spaces. And so I think that that is something you can and should think about when you're doing accessibility work. And I think that that is a different way of kind of making this bigger umbrella. Because there's lots of people that don't know that they're disabled, don't want to identify as disabled, don't really know what the options are around being disabled. And I think that the idea of kind of broadening that idea of who accessibility is for, um, is a way to kind of do that without kind of diluting the message, if that makes sense. So I think that those are helpful things to think about as far as kind of the bigger picture. And I think it's really heartening to see a lot of accessibility discussions starting to happen more in DEI spaces and things like that. So I think that this is something that um, can be really helpful to kind of put a lot of these discussions into context and to make it feel more like, okay, the decisions that we're making really have impact on people at the end of the day, and it's part of a bigger effort and a bigger struggle. If all else fails, prioritize reducing harm. If you can make an animation not animate on purpose or not automatically, you have reduced harm. Thank you. And ultimately, just be kind. I also have some resources that, like I said, I mentioned, I'll post the slide deck, some resources around systems thinking, around DEI thinking, around kind of disability justice that I think are helpful for this stuff too. Um, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm not really on any other social media anymore. I'm technically on Mastodon, but I don't ever check it. And you can also find me at my website, deepersing.com. And just to get on my little self promotion soapbox for a moment, I'm gonna have an ebook coming out this fall called the Accessibility Operations Guidebook. The idea is to help people who are trying to build accessibility programs who maybe don't have program experience, don't have organizational theory knowledge, kind of get a sense of like what are the types of things that it might be helpful to know, and what are some strategies you can use to make it not feel like a giant, overwhelming, um, nebulous mess that you're trying to deal with. So that's what that's about. And that's what I got. Thanks so much for joining. today.
Well, awesome, Devin. That was great. And we appreciate your insights and being willing to come and share that with us. We have time for just a couple questions. So there was one on your thoughts on any challenges involved with trying to use plain language in like a higher ed program that is notorious for jargony terms. And so this may even could apply outside higher ed, but when you're somewhere that has a lot of jargon, like art or medical school or law school, any thoughts on plain language?
Yeah, I think so. I think working higher ed is one of those areas that where maybe plain language isn't maybe your default because it kind of depends on who the information is for. I think if it, for example, is information that's aimed at master students in a field, you can probably be much more jargony, and that's okay because in theory, people are going to need to know those things to be studying or working at that level. I think if you've got stuff that, excuse me, if you do programs for the general public, for example, that's stuff that should ideally be plain language, but you can adapt that based on who your primary audience is, I think. So yeah, I don't feel like you need to go and be like, oh my God, our entire college website needs to be plain language. I don't think you need to do that, but I do think you should think about kind of who a section of the website or a particular page is aimed at and kind of work from there.
Awesome. So there were a few different questions about CAPTCHAs. Are there methods that you found to be more accessible for what people are trying to achieve with CAPTCHAs?
No. I think there's actually I meant to put a link to it in the deck, and I'll try to remember to do that before I post it. But um, the Web Accessibility Initiative has a kind of report, for lack of a better word, about CAPTCHAs, um, because they can't specifically say you can't use CAPTCHAs because they can't really say you can't use things. But they kind of outline all the reasons why CAPTCHAs are bad. And I think a lot of it comes down to like like I said earlier, even if it's technically accessible, even if you have like options and there's an audio option and there's different things, you're still assuming that someone can hear some garbled text or do a math problem or distinguish objects in pictures. Like you're still assuming that a person can do that task. And the assumption is that like humans can do these tasks and robots can't. And if you can't do this task, well, I guess you're a robot. It's just kind of it's just pretty demoralizing. So I would say like I'm not also not a computer security expert, but I know that there are ways that you can make your website secure that do not require humans to check the Google checkbox.
Right.
I think looking at other options that don't put the weight on the user, I think are important.
And I just put a link in the chat with some possibilities of things to think about. But yeah,
Awesome.
yeah. So trying to avoid captchas in general when possible, for sure. So I think our last question, we have like one more minute. It was talking about how most organizations, large and small, don't understand or care about accessibility as much, maybe, as they should, and a lot don't even know where to start. And so the question is, like, how can we make accessibility more accessible to people that don't understand? And they pointed out as a UX designer, there's a lot of resources, but that they're design focused, and it's kind of like a different path.
Yeah. Yeah. This is something that I continue to struggle with and think about, and I think probably will for the rest of my life. I think that it depends on the organization. I think it depends on what the organization's stated goals are. Like, I think a lot of this comes down to kind of some organizational psychology stuff and some like learning and getting comfortable with um, using data in ways that maybe you aren't normally doing so. And um, also feeling not personally like it's a personal failure if you try to implement something or get people on board with something and it doesn't happen because there are a lot of forces against you. Um, I think being nicer to ourselves and trying to do this work, it goes a long way, especially because so many people in this field suffer from burnout. So yeah, I don't have like a concise answer, but I think a lot of it depends on the organization and depends on who's trying to do the advocacy, and what they're trying to do and the scale. So I think a lot of it depends on, well, a lot of different factors, but
Yeah, that could be a whole talk, but yeah.
yes, that could be absolutely be a whole, it's a whole
Uh,
book that I've written. Um, and I don't want to say that I've included every possible thing in there, but yeah, it's a big area to think about. It's not as simple as, oh, well, this makes sense and it's morally correct, and people are just going to fall in line with it because they won't. It's a much bigger problem than just even getting people to think about accessibility.